In my end is my beginning. The throne came with a lass, and it will go with a lass.
Mary Queen of Scots was born here at Linlithgow Castle on the 8th of December 1542, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. Her father, James V, was across the border fighting the English. When the news arrived of the death of her father, she was 5 days old and Queen of Scotland. The little princess was baptized at the Church of St. Michael, and her mother, Mary of Guise, became regent. Soon the young child was sent to France for safety, and her letters told of the life that she led at the French court. By the time she was 15, she married Francis, the Dauphin. But her happiness was short-lived. In a jousting match, the King of France was killed, and for a brief period her husband became king, and she queen of 2 countries. But he too was soon to die, and at 18, Mary made the journey back to the land of her birth. After she returned as a widow from France, she found her native Scotland much changed. In her absence, the Reformation had swept through the country, and her subjects were no longer sympathetic to her faith. Her first Mass at Holyrood drew an angry crowd, led by John Knox, to the gates. Many, including Queen Elizabeth, felt she should marry again to ensure the continuation of the Stuart line. Her choice was to be her cousin, Lord Darnley. At her wedding, she cast aside her mourning garments and looked forward to a life of happiness with a new husband. Mary's choice of husband was ill-judged, and soon the dark clouds began to gather around her. Darnley proved to be dissolute and little help in running the kingdom, so Mary turned for help and friendship to her Italian secretary, David Rizzio. Jealousy and intrigue surrounded the Queen, and one night, as Rizzio sat at supper with her, a group of armed men, led by Darnley, burst in, and he was stabbed to death, and his body thrown to the ground below. Within weeks, Mary's child was born, and although she concealed her hatred of Darnley, Queen Elizabeth's spies were able to report that she now found loyalty and affection from James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell. Mary was to spend one of the most traumatic months of her life in this house at Jedburgh. She had come to conduct a court here, and also perhaps to escape from Edinburgh and its associations with Rizzio's murder. It was while she was here that she received word that Bothwell had been wounded. She rode the 25 miles to Hermitage Castle, a journey which was almost to cost her her life. It was a rough journey over wild border country, as Hermitage was only a few miles from the English frontier. The Earl of Bothwell had been wounded in a border skirmish and was recovering here in Hermitage Castle. After the murder of her friend Rizzio, Mary was to turn more and more to Bothwell, for help and support and perhaps even love. This grim castle provided no fit accommodation for a queen, so having assured herself that Bothwell was recovering, she determined to make the journey back to Jedburgh the same evening. Exhausted and ill, she lay in this little room for over a month on the verge of death. While Mary lay gravely ill, the monks of Jedburgh Abbey prayed for her recovery and prepared for her funeral. But Mary recovered, and she and Bothwell returned to Edinburgh to find her husband Darnley sick with smallpox. She moved him to a house at Kirkle Field outside Edinburgh, where she could visit him each day. It seemed almost as if she had forgiven Darnley. But one evening, as she returned to attend the wedding celebrations of one of her pages at Holyrood Palace, men were seen creeping toward the house at Kirkle Field. And Darnley's body was left strangled on the grass as the house exploded. Once more, Mary fled to the countryside, for the popular rumour was that Darnley had died at the hands of Bothwell's men. A group of armed soldiers was waiting for her, and she was carried off, though many say with little resistance, to the Earl of Bothwell's castle at Dunbar. When the news reached Edinburgh that she had in fact married James Hepburn, her subjects turned against her, and after 4 weeks they parted, Bothwell to go to Denmark and Mary to be sent to an island exile. Her story might well have ended here on Loch Leven. She had visited this castle through William Douglas in happier days, but now it was to become her prison. The warrant for her imprisonment was signed by 9 lords, and even as she was rowed across the loch, she was once more gravely ill. She was to remain as a prisoner of the Douglases for nearly a year. Her young son James was taken away from her and proclaimed King of Scotland. One of the servants in the castle, Willie Douglas, became infatuated with Mary, and together they planned her escape. One night, when everyone was at a banquet, he stole the keys and they slipped away to a waiting boat. Mary was to make one more hopeless attempt to raise an army before she acknowledged defeat and decided to leave her native land forever. She spent her last night in Scotland at Dundrennan Abbey. Here beside the Solway Firth, she resolved to cross over into England and throw herself on the mercy of Queen Elizabeth. The monks made her as comfortable as they could in these simple surroundings. Behind her were 3 tragic marriages, the loss of her son, and defeats in battle. Did she talk of this with Father Abbot, or did she pray for forgiveness and peace and calmer times in the years ahead? For they were not to be hers. She was leaving Scotland forever to spend her final 18 years under house arrest, always watched and continually surrounded by plots and intrigue. And when finally she was told that she was to be executed, she thanked God that at last he had put an end to all her troubles. And yet, the controversy over her life has continued down the centuries. As she truly said, "In my end is my beginning."
In my end is my beginning.